you are being lied to about inflation.
Lately, we've been hearing a lot about inflation.
Inflation rate.
Inflationary fires.
And you've definitely been feeling its effects, as the cost of everything in our lives has risen significantly over the past 2 years. Inflation is definitely happening, but not for the reasons you're being told. And the truth is, it's actually much worse than we've all been led to believe.
There are two main lies that we're being told about inflation. And the first lie is how high inflation actually is. Surprise, surprise, it is much higher than the official numbers that we are being given. The second lie is that the reason the price of goods and services is going up is because companies are being hit with higher material costs, which means that the end user's price also has to be on the rise. And this isn't entirely true either. And surprise, surprise, it has much more to do with the greed of companies. So let me talk about these two lies, starting with the first one of how high inflation really is.
In simple terms, inflation is the increase in cost of living, or in a nutshell, how expensive things around us have become over the last year. Very recently, inflation in the US was at 8.2%. In other words, basically the highest it's been in 40 years. And according to the World Bank, inflation is at 8.8% globally. But according to the most recent official figures, inflation is now cooling. The United States Consumer Price Index, or CPI, just reported a drop to 7.7%, causing Joe Biden to praise his government's efforts to get things under control. And this cooling has been reflected in other parts of the world as well, like in the Eurozone, that saw a drop in inflation from 10.6% down to 10%.
So yes, inflation does seem to be dropping a little, which should sound like fantastic news to everybody that's been affected by the prices of things rising. But here's the thing, our politicians aren't being entirely truthful about these numbers, and that's simply because inflation just isn't calculated the same way that it used to be.
I've spoken about this in previous videos, but inflation is actually much higher than we're being told. This is because in the 1980s and early 90s, the US changed the way it calculated inflation. So what happens if we calculate inflation today the way we used to? According to Shadow stats, inflation would be closer to 18%. In other words, more than double what we're being told. If true, inflation isn't the highest it's been in 40 years. Instead, it would be at a record high since 1947. And although there are many who disagree with Shadow Stats' exact numbers, the general consensus is that no matter what the real figure is, it's definitely not what we're being told by our governments.
So if you're wondering why things suddenly appear so much more expensive than we're being told, this is likely why. And it's because the government just doesn't want to be blamed for how bad things actually are. But here is the thing. It isn't just the government likely responsible for the high inflation. Instead, it's the multinational corporations that have a monopoly on everything that you buy. And so this is where I talk about lie number 2. What is at the root cause of inflation?
The general narrative around inflation is this. During times of crisis, like the health crisis in 2020, the economy slows. And to stimulate the economy, governments print a lot of money. This devalues each dollar in existence, causing things around you to become more expensive. And over time, the prices we can expect to pay for things slowly increase.
And yes, this is definitely a part of the inflation equation. However, companies all around the world have hijacked this narrative in order to increase their profit to record numbers.
Inflation has definitely caused the price of raw materials to rise. However, thousands of companies have been increasing their prices at a much higher rate than the increase in material costs. Let's take Tyson Foods, for example. Tyson is the largest processor of meat products in the US and one of the largest on the planet. When inflation started rearing its head last year, Tyson started increasing its prices, according to its CEO, because consumers had to help pay for the cost of inflation. But while inflation was sitting at around 7%, Tyson's prices rose much more. In the case of pork and beef, up to 3 times the rate of inflation. As you might expect, this caused Tyson's profits to swell to almost unheard of levels, a massive 48% compared to the year before. And Tyson isn't alone on this apparent price gouging under the cover of inflation. Collectively, US companies had one of the most profitable years ever in 2021, posting their highest profit margins on record since 1950. According to reports, simply because they were hiking prices using the excuse of inflation to make enormous profits. In other words, making everyone's lives more difficult through nothing nothing more than pure greed.
Now that you know this, are you actually surprised at all? Let me know your thoughts down below. Now, most people would think that this type of price gouging would be impossible in today's world because I think a lot of us believe that we live in a world filled with competition, but this just isn't true. And I'll talk about that in a second. But first, I just want to mention that we have this really epic newsletter. People love it. There's 75,000 people plus. Open rates are incredible. People just eat up this extra financial information that we are given in beautifully written stories. There's a link down below. Now, let's go back to the topic of how little competition there actually is in our world today.
With literally millions of different products that are available for us to purchase, it would seem as if we have a lot of choice. And it would make sense that if a maker of one of these products unethically increases its prices, its competitors would fight to keep the prices low in order to win more business. But the simple reality is that we don't actually have much choice at all. We only have the illusion of choice. Take your entertainment, for example. In the evenings, you might sit down to watch something on ABC News or enjoy a Marvel or Star Wars movie. Or you might stream some sports on ESPN or Fox Sports. Or maybe you'll check out a documentary on the History Channel or Vice or Nat Geo. But if you do any of these things, you're really tuning in to watch Disney, which is the owner of every one of these brands and many, many more. Now let's look at your daily shopping. You go down to your local supermarket and pick something off a shelf. Chances are that product, no matter what it is owned by one of only 11 massive corporations. Companies like Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Unilever, or P&G. And it doesn't take much for these companies to work together to increase their prices. Take the example of PepsiCo. Last year, Pepsi raised its prices, blaming inflation for raising prices on its ingredients, labor, and transport. At the time, inflation was only sitting at around 6%. However, PepsiCo's price increase resulted in an almost 40% increase in its revenue compared to the previous quarter. The reason PepsiCo is able to do this is because they really only have one competitor, the Coca-Cola company. And wouldn't you know it, at the same time Pepsi massively increased its prices using the excuse of inflation, Coca-Cola did exactly the same thing.
In other words, there's really little to no competition at all. And here's how bad the situation actually is.
In 1994, the percentage of industries in the United States dominated by only a few companies was 0%. In other words, no industry was controlled by only a few large players. But just 25 years later, in 2020, this was a completely different story, with almost every industry in the US, from manufacturing to entertainment to food and everything in between, being completely owned by only a handful of companies. Obviously, this means that there is much more of an ability for these companies to control market prices and to use an event like inflation to drastically jack up prices. Or to put it very simply, here's former US Labor Secretary Robert Reich.
These corporations have so much market power, they can raise prices with impunity. So the underlying problem isn't inflation per se, it's lack of competition.
So, to summarize, yes, inflation is absolutely happening, and yes, it partially has to do with your government's excess printing of money. However, it disproportionately is being caused by a handful of massive companies that own most of the goods and services that you use on a daily basis. And they are just using the excuse of inflation to line their pockets with money. Now, if you like this video, you might also like the recent video we did about inflation and how the printing of money contributes to all of that. There is a link on the screen right now. Thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe. We would love to have you part of this community. Also, don't forget that epic newsletter. You don't want to miss out. And last, we do have an amazing private membership where people learn more about finance and freedom so that they can master this aspect of their life. There is a link in the bio for that, and I will see you in the next one.